This is Hannibal here from the HannibalTV.com with a UFO related interview, or UAP as they're called these days, with a guest we've had on several times. He's a ufologist, UFO author, expert in all things paranormal, including this new book, Humanoids and High Strangeness, one of his many books that he's come out with. Preston Dennett, how are you doing today, sir? All the way from California.
I'm doing very well, thank you. Hope you're doing well too.
Oh, yes. And as far as this book, 20 True UFO Encounters, the last time I interviewed you, you had an abductee on with you who was the subject of your last book. Is that one included in this book as well?
No, that was probably you're talking about Dolly Saffron,
Yes.
who has had very extensive experiences. This book involves 20 all new cases, none of which have been published before. So these are all pretty much extensive cases, each involving someone who has seen some type of humanoid being. So we have a wide variety. That's kind of what I wanted to do with this book, is show how much variation we have in the types of humanoids people are seeing. So there's cases involving praying mantis type ETs, all types of grays, human looking ETs, short little hairy dwarves, tall whites, a couple of Bigfoot cases, even nature spirits and elves and sort of interdimensional beings, angels as well. So really just about everything you've heard of.
The first time I heard about these short looking hairy dwarfs was John Lear talking about it in his interview with George Knapp. John Lear, who held world records in flying and was the son of the inventor of the Learjet. Supposedly, they have great strength. What do you know about these? I guess they're about 4 feet tall, 3.5 to 4 feet, hairy and super strong.
Yeah, I have heard that in a number of cases. The case I have, that guy didn't actually have direct physical contact. I mean, he had a face to face encounter. So I couldn't say how strong it was. But yeah, he definitely described one of these very hairy dwarves, which he said was actually quite frightening. He was, let's see if I've got this correct. He was about,
You got a werewolf behind you.
oh yeah, that's a Great Dane. He owns the house. So, um, so yeah, the case I have involving this hairy dwarf was actually occurred in England, of all places. And it was in January of 1980 when an 8-year-old boy, when an 8-year-old boy had just had his birthday and was decided he was going to go into his father's room and sleep with his father because he was a little bit lonely. And so crawled into his dad's bed. At that point, the door was opened, but the knob started to wiggle, and the door swung open, and out from behind the door, he saw a shadow coming on the wall. It was short, and out comes this short, hairy little dwarf with big, sharp teeth, hair all over its body. He said it looked to him almost like a demonic ape, and really frightened him to the degree that he couldn't even move. He wanted to wake up his father, but was too frightened to even do that. So he just shut his eyes and prayed that it would go away. After a minute or two, he opened his eyes and it was still there. And it was looking right into his eyes. So there was a little bit of a staring contest going on there. And it stayed there for a good few minutes. Really quite frightened him. Because, I mean, he's an 8-year-old kid, 10-year-old kid. So after finally, it just backed up, went behind the door, and closed it back up, and off it went. At that point, he was able to wake up his dad, who told him, "Oh, you must have just had a nightmare." But the thing was, he was never asleep. He didn't fall asleep. He didn't wake up. This was a fully conscious experience.
And how did you find him? Because that, I guess that would have happened probably a while ago if he's an adult now telling the story.
Yeah, he actually contacted me after watching some of my stuff on YouTube. I do get a lot of people who come to me because of my website or perhaps books I've written or hear me on a podcast like this one, or perhaps are referred to me by friends. So I've got kind of a wide network of people who reach out to me. And he was very
You're in
curious.
several documentaries as well. Just to interrupt you there, but I randomly saw you in an early '90s UFO documentary on YouTube with a hat on. Right? You're on a boat or something. Yeah.
Right, deep sea UFOs. I remember that
Yes.
one. Yeah, that was on the History Channel quite some time ago. Yeah, it was not too long ago on Ancient Aliens. So, yeah, I've been on TV a number of times over the years. I mean, I've been at this a long time, since 1986, which is well over 35 years.
Now, when you first started looking into deep sea UFOs, because I've come to the realization now that it seems like all of them go underwater, don't they? Pretty much.
Yeah,
When you first heard about this, did you think that these were custom UFOs that just went underwater, or were you always pretty aware with what seems to be the common knowledge now that they can go underwater in our atmosphere and outside of our atmosphere?
yeah, I think pretty early on I realized that these are what we would call transmedium vehicles that can go into outer space, travel through our atmosphere, can go underwater, and for that matter, can actually go into the ground itself. Because there are cases of that. And I started getting cases like that very early on, including USOs, quite a few of them. So that's how I got into the whole USO phenomena, which I have to say wasn't getting much attention at all. But where I was located in, Southern California, the coast there has a huge number of USO cases, probably one of the top producers in the world. I mean, mile for mile. I collected about 150 cases, and they certainly weren't all mine. I mean, pretty much every major researcher in that area had a whole host of cases like that. So there's something going on there for sure.
This is a question that's interesting. There's obviously numerous reasons for it, but Brett wants to know, why do you think the government is now just being open about UFOs? And for the people that still deny that they exist, the government actually has in the U.S. An unidentified anomalous phenomenon task force. So they wouldn't
Yep.
be investing all this money in a whole branch of the government if these things were fictional.
Yeah, that's really unprecedented to see the kind of attention we're getting today because it hasn't been like that for decades. There's been no official movement whatsoever. So that's really unusual. And I think probably the main driving force behind the steps towards disclosure we're seeing is not because they're voluntarily doing it for the good of the people, but because they've been painted into a corner a little bit. There is so much evidence now in the public arena proving the existence of this phenomena that to admit to its veracity would make you look not credible. I honestly think that if they don't start taking steps towards disclosure, they're going to become irrelevant, not believed anymore. They will lose control of the narrative. I think they're doing it for their benefit, likely involuntarily. But yeah, it definitely feels really tightly controlled to me, the way they're rolling out information, because it's just little bits and pieces. I mean, we're not getting the craft or the bodies or really any good film for that matter. We've seen some, but I know for a fact that they have much better footage.
And they have admitted that the videos that were released, there's actually longer versions of it, and a lot of these are taken by Navy craft, so it's not like the radar isn't taken into analysis with these things. Because I know some people have said those are birds and so forth on some of the UFOs that the Navy pilots have seen, but these are trained observers that are flying the highest tech of machinery. I think they would know what they're seeing and what they're not.
Yeah, well, you can tell just by their voice recordings when they're swearing and going, "Wow, look at that!" And yeah, I mean, it's quite obvious that they certainly believe that this is anomalous. And they're the ones who are there. And like you say, they're trained observers. They're very familiar with aircraft. So, yeah, it's really kind of exciting to see all the movement and the statements that are coming forth. And those recent congressional hearings, which were just a couple of weeks ago, I was actually really surprised that the rhetoric that was being used was unequivocally saying that there is a cover up, that members of Congress have actually seen UFOs, and that they want the cover up to end, and that the Pentagon wasn't cooperating, which we're still seeing pushback from the AARO office, the AARO. Sean Kirkpatrick, who heads it, is making some pretty heated statements about these recent whistleblowers, Grush, and the other military witnesses like Fravor and Graves. So we'll see how this rolls out, but definitely there's fireworks going on behind the scene.
Yeah, I know that they tried to discredit Grush as well because he has seen active military duty, so obviously he suffers from PTSD, and I guess he had alcohol issues like a lot of military veterans have coming out of war zones, and he was still kept on with the government after he had his little suicidal attempt, or
Right.
it was just feelings. He didn't actually attempt suicide, but they still kept him in his position, so he was still credible enough to work with the government. But now, whoever leaked this to the press, I mean, it seems awfully convenient.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's a rare
discredit.
soldier, or anyone who's in the military in active service who hasn't suffered some form or level of PTSD. And we know that the rate of suicide among people who've experienced active duty is double what is in the normal population. So that's not really an excuse. His resume is clearly impeccable. They have not been able to debunk that. I think he's a good witness. I do wonder if his testimony is to an extent sanctioned, that he was told, we want you to go out there. I mean, I have no evidence of this. It just all feels very tightly controlled. And if he truly had evidence that was a threat to the secret government or the cabal, they would just do away with him, because we know people have lost their lives under suspicious circumstances who are what we would call whistleblowers. So it's pretty
He's
interesting.
claimed he's been threatened, though, hasn't he? Like he's made official complaints about being threatened.
Yeah. He says he suffered pretty severe reprisals, which doesn't surprise me, because I know, like, if you're in the police force and you report a UFO, you could very easily lose your job. There are many cases of that. Look what happened to John Mack, the Harvard professor who said he was only studying UFOs. He didn't have an encounter, not that he publicly revealed, and they tried to get rid of him. Many people have lost their jobs over this issue, which is a real shame, because now we know that this is real. There is enough evidence.
I actually watched those congressional hearings three times. The last one with Grush and the two military guys, and I thought the questions from Congress were overall very good, and they seemed legitimately interested in the subject, and they weren't treating it like a joke. So I find that like at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, there was no ridiculous giggling. Like, they did say, "Oh, we're not going to talk about little green men," but in fact, they did. So the subject of quote non-human intelligence was brought up. Biological beings that are not from Earth. They're kind of dancing around the issue of this being extraterrestrials. What I think it's clear if you examine the totality of the evidence, that's what we're dealing with here. So I don't fully understand why they don't just say extraterrestrials. If these are vehicles and they've got beings inside them, I think it's pretty clear that's what they are. Perhaps there are interdimensional elements to it, or ways that they seem to defy physics as we know it, but I don't think that precludes them being extraterrestrial in origin. I suspect they know where these guys come from.
There's one guy asking you what you think about Bob Lazar's claims, and another guy wondering if you believe Bob Lazar's story more after Grush's testimony came out.
I do. And I can't say that I've interviewed Bob Lazar myself or anything like that, but I've certainly reviewed everything he's ever said on this subject, and I find it very credible. And whenever anyone is viciously attacked and debunked, or debunking attempts made at them from both sides, it kind of raises my eyebrows. Because if this is a person who is not telling the truth, why is so much attention being paid to him? And frankly, what he said has been repeated by many other whistleblowers. And really, as a person myself who concentrates mostly on firsthand contactee accounts, I can tell you a good number of them have told me that they are absolutely convinced of Bob Lazar's veracity, because the craft that they were on were very much, if not identical in a few cases, to what Bob Lazar was describing. And I talked to a gentleman who was a contactee in Utah, who, when Bob Lazar's drawings were released, he said, that was exactly the kind of craft I was on. I absolutely believe Bob Lazar because it looked just like that. So yeah, I am a believer in Bob Lazar. He's an early whistleblower, but these latest three are just a few. They're the tip of the iceberg. There's not just 10 or 20 or even 100 of these guys. There's hundreds upon hundreds of military whistleblowers waiting, and witnesses, even more of those, waiting in line to tell their account without losing their jobs or their retirement, or basically being punished for violating an NDA. And I've talked to a few myself, so I know that there are a lot of them.
And Bob Lazar, the other credible thing about his story is he was talking about this element 115, I think it's called, from the periodic table before it ever became an element. And I guess he knew about this from his time at Area 51.
Yeah, and I've talked to George Knapp, who I think is a very credible and thorough researcher, who basically put his career on the line and suffered incredible ridicule for moving into the UFO field. He was a mainstream journalist who basically left that to pursue the UFO story, as people like Leslie Kean have done, at considerable risk to their own professional reputation. And he is an absolute believer. I think investigators who really dig in and look at the Lazar story objectively, putting aside their own personal beliefs, have to say that there is good, solid information coming from what he's talking about. I think he's a legit whistleblower. I really do.
As far as George Knapp's statement to Congress, I'm sure you saw that. Did you see he had a written testimony?
I believe so. Yeah. He's working hard. Of course, Stephen Greer has spearheaded this to a certain extent. And gosh, what's the other guy's name? I forget it, but he's always talking about the truth embargo. Not Robert Salas, who is the Malmstrom guy. His name will come to me, but he's another guy who I think is working very hard to end this cover-up, which is actually beginning to collapse really under the weight of its own lies. It's been going on for so long, and the cover-up is not speculation by any means. It's easily demonstrable through documents released from the Freedom of Information Act. We can prove this government cover-up. There's no doubt it's there.
Yeah, I guess George Knapp has had access to some Russian UFO documents related to Russia actually having conflicts with UAPs, I guess, in the late 80s, early 90s. Have you researched anything into that?
I can't say that I have, really, no. There's so much to keep up with these days that you have to really be doing this full time to cover all your bases. Now, I do try to concentrate mostly on where I think there's real pay dirt. There's a few front lines of UFO research, and definitely I think disclosure, that front is one of the really areas of research where there's real pay dirt or a potential for it. But I also think the heart and core of the UFO contact phenomena is really with contactees, people who have face-to-face contact, people who are being taken on board, because sightings have a limited amount of information to them, and you're very much stonewalled when you're trying to deal with government and politics and exopolitics, to use a current term. But with contactees, you get loads of information about who the ETs are, why they're here, what their agenda is, and basically what is the whole thing going on with the extraterrestrial presence on our planet.
Now, you say you've been researching this since 1986. On average, how many hours a day do you research UFOs?
Well, for the for the past couple of years, it's pretty much all day. I am doing this full time right now because when the pandemic hit, I started working part time and then basically got laid off. So it was a wonderful opportunity to just dig in. Thankfully, I did have a little bit of money set aside because, as you probably know, this field don't doesn't really have the potential to make a lot of money in it. So before that, yeah, I worked full time. I worked full time for 35 years. So this was something I did after work and on weekends, and would devote whatever time I could, which was a few hours a day on weekdays and pretty much all weekends. So we're, I don't know, 20 hours a week at least, 25. But now, yeah, it's full time, 40 hours, 50 hours. Well, let's face it, I work late into the night. It's probably a little more than that. Yeah, I'm always researching.
Yeah, I could imagine because since I became more interested in it, I'm spending 3 to 4 hours a day, and the time goes by so fast. So I could only imagine all of your hours added up over the years. You've got a bunch of fan questions here. Someone wants to know the most convincing account you've researched.
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. There are a number of cases that really stick out because people have been able to provide good, hard evidence. Dolly Safran, the book I wrote on her, Symmetry, definitely is one of them because she was able to provide photographic evidence, corroborating witnesses, medical evidence, and actually showed me the UFOs herself. So that gave it to me absolute proof. Another case that comes to mind involves a housewife from, let's see, Indiana, who had a 14-year-old son who she took to the dentist, and they took dental x-rays, and these x-rays showed a foreign body under his tooth, under his molar tooth. And the dentist freaked out because this was a round, sort of BB-shaped object, larger than a BB, but was clearly metallic, opaque under an x-ray, and artificial. This could not be a natural thing in this kid's mouth. She sent me the x-rays, multiple x-rays, 5 or 10 of them actually. And I did send them to a primary physician and a ER doctor. And both of them said the same thing, that this is a foreign body. It's not natural. And what's really interesting is this is quite large underneath the tooth. There's no entry wound. The tooth is asymptomatic, meaning it's perfectly fine. And this is really good evidence of what we would call an alien implant. It's undeniable that something is going on here. But yeah, there's a lot of cases. I mean, I investigated a wave of sightings over Topanga Canyon, if I may, real quick, from 1992 to 1994, which was one of my earlier cases. But that had 50 or up to 100 witnesses. And on one night, there was about 30 people I've interviewed who were situated in a very sort of tightly defined area, who all saw activity on one night. So when a bunch of people are describing the same thing and they don't know each other, that is absolutely incontrovertible evidence. It's eyewitness testimony, but that's still evidence. It holds up in a court of law that something was going on. But yeah, there are quite a few cases I've researched which really impress me.
And as far as you mention all the different beings, I think I've heard it could have been used, say, up to 30 different civilizations that could be visiting us in one of your interviews, but I've heard anywhere from at least five to up to 30. How many of these visitors are like artificial intelligence or robots or clone type things because the people from these other places can't necessarily travel this far, and how many are actual biological beings, would you say, would you guess?
Yeah, that's very hard to give an exact percentage or number. I will say that it's clear that these beings can visit us from distant star systems. I think their technology is very advanced to the point where they can do this because there are contactees who say they've been taken to other worlds. And there are a wide variety. I would say there's 5 or 10 major types because we do see a lot of grays, praying mantis, human looking, little blue beings, tall whites, and really strange humanoids of every kind. Pretty much all humanoids. But definitely some are what we would call artificial intelligence. And I would point to the short little grays, about 3 feet tall, sometimes described as 4 feet tall, not really showing a whole lot of emotion. These are often the little guys who come into people's bedrooms and pick them up and pull them onto a craft where they meet perhaps a mid-sized gray who is more emotional, who is clearly biological because people smell organic odors. I mean, these ETs do have a certain body odor, is the only way I can really put it. But yeah, these little guys, there's some good evidence that they are artificial intelligence because Dolly Saffron talked about this, Whitley Strieber, others say that these little AI grays can actually be shut off, stacked up like cordwood, stored in a closet, turned off and on. So they're not alive as we would think of it, although they may be biological androids. But I would say, a good percentage of the grays that people are describing are probably those, because a lot of people do say that the beings that they were in contact with didn't express a whole lot of emotion. And I think that's probably the AI grays that people are describing.
Speaking of the tall whites, have you heard of Charles Hall and his story about them?
I sure have. I've read his books, Millennial Hospitality. I saw him speak. He published them as, quote, semi-fictional, but I believe he's now basically come forward and said, this is my true life story. I found it very compelling. He seems like a very honest witness who went through the steps necessary to protect himself from reprisals. And I found it a very interesting account of him being a weather radar man out there in the Nellis Air Force Base, of his encounters with tall white ETs, which do match up with a lot of what other people have described. And the fact that he's came away from it with a very strong interest in mathematics and quantum physics and free energy and these kinds of things is also a pattern I've seen before. He seems like a very sincere guy. I haven't interviewed him personally to any great length, but I do find his story very compelling. Yeah.
He does have the credibility factor as far as his degrees and background and his intelligence. The only thing that's kind of hard to believe, but I have watched lots of his speeches and I do have his books, is that the government is that deep into it with a whole base for the tall whites. But I mean, he
Yeah.
doesn't. It's an It's very compelling story for sure.
Yeah. I don't know that we have ever done any deals with the ETs because there's a lot of that rumor going around that we have traded technology, or the ETs have given us technology, and quote, to allow abductions to take place. I personally think that's disinformation. I have not been able to track that down to a really good source that I find credible. I do think the Edwards Air Force Base meeting in 1954 in California February of 1954 did take place. The reporting on that is very good. And I think most researchers have looked into it, say that that probably did happen. But I doubt the Greys would hand over technology to a government with such a history of abusing it. So I don't know. There's a lot of controversy about that. But I can tell you contactees have asked about it and been told, no, the ETs do not hand over technology of any kind, not voluntarily. Though, yes, UFOs have crashed and been scooped up by governments across the world. So we absolutely do have craft and bodies and have reverse engineered it to a certain degree. I think the reporting on that is very good.
Have you heard the theories that nuclear weapons can actually cause them to crash, or for the USOs, the nuclear weapons that have been exploded around water can cause vibrations to happen within the water that screw up their mechanisms? And this could be possibly one of the reasons why they are concerned about nuclear weapons.
I wouldn't put it that way. I don't think that we have ever really shot down these things. I know there are some reports of that, but if you look at these cases of UFOs, basically flying circles around our fastest aircraft and having complete telepathy, they know long before any missile or even a particle beam weapon would be coming towards them. And I don't think that they are being brought down by any nuclear weapons really whatsoever. But I do think that their concern about it is twofold. One is that it has the potential to completely destroy us and our planet, and they are certainly worried about that. But also because, and I've gotten this from a number of contactees, that when we explode nuclear material, it has effects not only in the three-dimensional universe, but beyond that, and is affecting areas we're not even aware of. It has a rippling effect into other dimensions and causing all kinds of damage that we know nothing about, not to mention permanently polluting whatever area that these weapons are being used. So I think that there's a double concern there on the part of the ETs, and that's why they're so concerned. And that's why, like the Malmstrom incident in March of 1967 is a good example of how deeply concerned they are about our use of nuclear material, really in any form. Because if you look at any place that nuclear material is being used, whether it's a power plant or a nuclear submarine with nuclear torpedoes, or a ship that's nuclear powered, or a power station or missiles or anything, they have a history of encounters there. I would point to the work of, what's his name? He wrote UFOs and Nukes. It's absolutely a required book on this subject.
Robert Hastings or something.
That's right. Thank you, Robert Hastings.
There's good hearings with them too online if people want to search that up.
Yeah, because I had a personal case involving a USO from a gentleman who I would classify as a whistleblower. Ray Sachs is his name. He's quite elderly and wanted to do his part. He said that in 1971, he was a young man on the USS Clamagore. This is a submarine that carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes and was traveling on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean up the east coast of the United States at night, going about 12 knots, when a USO came zooming in at about 100 knots, very fast, and started pacing the submarine right next to it. And that just doesn't happen with other ocean-going vehicles. If you're more than within a quarter mile of another sea-going craft, that's considered a near miss. And it causes all kinds of to-do and paperwork. Whatever this was, it wasn't ours. It was a big bright light, circular, right below the surface, very bright. And he said it was about 20 to 30 feet wide, totally silent. He was on the surface as a lookout, along with another petty officer, the commander, and the second in command. This thing paced the Clamagore, he says, for about 15 minutes, during which time most of the higher ranking officers came up on deck because they wanted to take a little look-see at whatever this thing was. After 15 minutes, it darted off in another direction at about 80 knots. And here's what I found really interesting. At that point, the second in command turned to the commander. Commander Boyne is his name. I looked all this up. I verified Ray Sachs' employment. He was on the Clamagore. And the second in command turned to the commander and said, "Sir, how would you like me to report this incident in the log?" And the commander turned to him and said, "Officers who report this sort of incident do not move up in rank." Direct quote. So this wasn't recorded in the logbook. And having related this incident before, I've been contacted by other submariners who had similar incidents and said, "Yep, that's exactly what happens. There's no paper trail, and there's many incidents like this kind. And the vast majority we never hear about. This is a regular occurrence with these submarines and Navy ships."
Very interesting stuff. Someone says, why don't they just reveal themselves? Wasn't there a series, a wave of UFO sightings in July 1952 around Washington?
There sure was. Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, they just about did. And probably would have or might have had we not reacted in the way we did, which was quite hostilely. We scrambled jets after them. And there was a recent, well, not a recent case, but there was a case I looked into in North Carolina where a gentleman came upon a landed UFO and ETs came out and he talked to them and he asked them that same question. And their answer kind of made me chuckle. They said, "We already have." He says, "Why don't you reveal yourselves?" They said, "We have." And I had to laugh because that's true. If you look at the history of UFO encounters, you will see many, countless examples of what researchers call displays. And I would point to the wave of 1954 in France, where everyone in that country knew that UFOs were real because this was a very intense wave involving literally hundreds of landings. And we see this again and again and again. The Topanga Canyon wave of 1992 to 94, Mexico City wave in 1991 during a solar eclipse. A UFO stayed up in the sky right over Mexico City for about an hour. It was videotaped by 30 different people throughout the city. This is a display. They are revealing themselves. Look at the Hudson Valley wave, the Gulf Breeze wave, the Wytheville, Virginia, the Belgium wave. There's many, many examples. Look at the 100 plus schoolyard UFO encounters like Rua, Zimbabwe Aerial Elementary School, the Westall High School case in 1966, Opelika, same day, 1967, the Hillsdale, Michigan case, Broadhaven Elementary. These are just a few of the many schoolyard encounters. I wrote a book on that, as I did on drive-in theater of all places. I've got 100 cases of UFOs putting on displays over drive-in theaters. They have showed themselves. They've regularly done this. And one final and really kind of indisputable example of this is the Kumbargaz Turkey footage of 2007, 8, and 9, which the Turkish government has said is bona fide, which anyone who's looked into it has not been able to debunk it. And this shows a very structured craft with little beings inside, taken with a very high quality camera over and over again. Yes, they've shown themselves. The proof is there. No, they haven't filled the sky and remained there. I think they're no better than to do that because that could cause quite a bit of upset in our society. And that's not what they want to do. They are taking steps to do a publicity campaign that has been extremely effective because now we have a population that the majority of them do believe UFOs are real, and at least 10 to 20% have personally experienced it.
When was that Turkey case?
Now, that was over a period of 3 years. And if you just type in the Turkey UFO footage, it was 2000, if I'm correct, 7, 8, and 9. And it is extraordinarily, some of the best photographic evidence I think we've gotten. But there's lots, the Tim Salita or Tim Edwards footage in Salita, Colorado, was exhaustively analyzed, and no one has ever been able to debunk that either. That's other really good footage. The Mexico City footage. People say there's no photographic evidence. I'd say, hold on a second. There is excellent footage. So there's all forms of evidence. I mean, there's thousands of landing trace cases, which cannot be explained in any other way than a craft that was superheated, landed on the ground, and basically glassified the sand. I mean, I would point to the Delphos, Kansas case. I would point to the Trans-en-Provence case. Of course, the very famous Lani Zamora case in Socorro, New Mexico. That showed evidence of very high heat. So there's absolute great physical evidence. They have provided enough evidence for anyone, I think, who has an open mind to convince them of the reality of UFOs.
I know that the France government is very open about it, as you just mentioned. Of course, apparently the Chilean government is also open about it. And there's that famous video from 2014, I think, that's been analyzed to death from the Chilean military that's come out with the UFO that under imaging there's like a cool uh, radius around it, and then it leaks out this exhaust. Do you know anything about this one?
Um, I think I know what you're talking about. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I'm absolutely aware of the Chile's government and being more forthcoming, certainly, than most. And I think the reason for that is because some of those very high-ranking military officials were having their own encounters, and it reached such a point of saturation where so many of them were having encounters that this was not something you could hide. That's what happened with the Mexico government, who has also been very forthcoming, more so, I should say, than most countries, because when that incident happened in 1991, you couldn't cover it up. To say it didn't happen would make you look like an idiot because they had the evidence. I don't know if the US government will be the one who finally discloses. I honestly don't think any of our governments across the superpowers and across the world are going to voluntarily disclose. They've lied since day one. They're still lying. Even these recent congressional hearings are not disclosure by any means. These are just testimonies from whistleblowers, and that's it. No evidence has been forthcoming from a sitting government that is proving the reality of UFOs. And to me, the end game of disclosure would be the craft, the bodies. Show us that, and then people will sit up and listen. But until we get that, I don't think that this is going to reach the populace in any way that has any real effect. Because now this subject is just so saturated in our society, and there's so much CGI and fakery that people are a bit jaded. We've had so many lies for so long that it's a real mess at this point.
Yeah, and this is the military picture of that Chile UFO that the government itself they officially said they couldn't explain this. That's the exhaust trail from the thing, which it was unusual for sure. And as you say, with all the fakery, you got to say that the military stuff is at least the most credible video that can come out because it's taken with the highest of technology, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of really good footage out there, but with so much of it being swamped by CGI and flat out disinformation and misinformation and lies, it gets overwhelmed and overlooked, which is a real shame because the evidence is there. It's just at this point, with all the Photoshop that's available to even the average citizen, photographs don't hold the weight that they used to. So I don't know. And there's another problem in terms of the reverse engineering that's going on with the TR-3Bs and numerous drones being flown around. And if you've ever seen a drone show, or for that matter, the holograms that we're seeing in some of these advertisements, you would never know that that was a hologram. It would convince anyone that this is a genuine, solid object. So we're now at a situation where it's very difficult for researchers and experiencers alike, anyone, to really look up in the sky and identify an object as being extraterrestrial or government.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago in around British Columbia, Canada, there was a hologram of a UFO shown at a minor league baseball stadium, and it made national news here. And then they just came out and said that it was a hologram, and they did it to get publicity. But it made all the UFO people look dumb because, of course, they all got excited for it.
Yeah, I mean, there are reports that the Phoenix Lights, at least some of them, were holograms. And that concerns me because there are a number of people who saw that who said that they could see the stars right through it. I think there's a little bit of conflating going on with real craft and holograms. But yeah, I mean, even the drones themselves can be very, very convincing. And people are not always great witnesses. Even trained observers can get fooled pretty easily. So you cannot be too careful when it comes to, I've seen this taking people's testimonies and later finding out that no, this was not a genuine UFO. But genuine UFOs do show certain characteristics. For example, when someone sees an object moving through the sky, it stops and turns at a right angle and has no sound whatsoever. That's what we would call one of the observables. Really, one of the biggest tells is when a craft sort of flutters or moves in a pendulum-like pattern, or kind of like is riding waves. Because we do know from contactee reports and from genuine UFO sightings that they're using the gravitational fields, magnetic field lines of our planet to maneuver. And that's why you see that sort of fluttering motion, falling leaf motion. It's often been described. So when I hear people describing that, I'm like, okay, this is probably a genuine case.
Just trying to look up the Turkey UFO there. Someone wants to know, with all the new revelations about contacts, we be wary of the federal government's possibly orchestrating a false flag?
Yeah, I'm wary of it. I think there's a lot of buzz about this in the UFO community for good reason. Because if you look into it, it's clear that they are pursuing an ET threat narrative, which I don't think is warranted or supported by the actual first-hand cases. If you look at what actually happens to people who are taken on board, it can be very scary. But the majority of contactees, certainly that I've interviewed, don't think it's a nefarious phenomena. Many have been healed. They're shown the engine room, told how the craft work. They're taken up to the control room, sat in the pilot seat, told how to fly the craft or shown how it's flown, taken to the observation deck. Having a lot of spiritual experiences, given warnings of all kinds against nuclear proliferation or warlike ways, pollution, destruction of the environment. Overall, this is not a nefarious phenomena. I have no cases of people being tortured or hurt. And yet, we see my labs where people are having horrific encounters with what apparently are fake ET abductions. And we see our governments pushing this ET threat narrative in these recent congressional hearings. So I'm concerned about it. I think that there is some good evidence that this is exactly what they're trying to do. Not too long ago, I believe it was in January of this year, we had all those balloons, quote balloons, UFOs, flying around and being shot down. And it was clear to me that those weren't genuine UFOs because they didn't have the observables. Frankly, we can't shoot them down. It's not likely our governments would ever admit to actually shooting down a UFO. It stunk of propaganda to me. And I feel like this was part of the whole initial stages of the false flag ET invasion. I'm concerned about it. There was a recent incident in Peru about hostile ETs attacking villagers. And I'm kind of waiting to see how the reporting goes on that, because that looks like it might be right along those lines of this ET threat narrative being pushed forward.
The UFO in Turkey, where there appears to be alien shadows, that there was a fan talking about it in the comments. This is the enhanced picture of it, apparently. Have you seen that?
There's much better footage than this. I can't say that I can quite make out what that is,
Sorry.
but
Supposedly, that's enhancement of the UFO craft in Turkey, where supposedly there's beings in it.
yeah, well, there's really good footage of, you can see it where it's this basic sort of largely a disc shape, and in the center there's a little sort of transparent section where you can see two, three beings moving about, and it is very convincing because the Turkish government themselves did analyze it and declared it genuine. Professional researchers went over there and declared it genuine. I think it's some of the best footage we have out there. The picture you showed isn't the one I'm familiar with, but there's some definitely really good footage of that you can find pretty easily online by typing in Turkey. I think the actual location is Kumbargaz, Kumbargaz, or something close to that. But yeah, that is some of the best footage we have out there currently, I think.
I'll search it up. Someone wants to know, how credible would you say the Kelly Hopkins encounter is? I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, that was a 1950s encounter in which the Sutton family had a UFO land near their house, and out came two or three short little beings. One who actually went on the roof, reached down and tried to grab one of the witnesses. A Sutton family, which had numerous members, was quite overwhelmed by it and actually shot at one of the entities, not able to damage it, but caused it to retreat, certainly. And they ended up piling into their car and rushing to the police station. And the police who took the report said that it was clear this family was very frightened. And they went back to this farmhouse, didn't see anything there. But after the police left, these ETs allegedly returned. I think it's a credible case. And if you look into it, it's not a one-off. There was numerous people in that area who were seeing UFOs at that time, which I think lends an extra level of corroboration to it.
Yeah, always when there's more than one people that don't necessarily know each other, that definitely helps the credibility. Just for the fans out there, you were mentioning earlier you've been on some TV shows and some documentaries. These are all the TV shows you have credit for related to UFO. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, you're missing one that, which is really funny to me, which is the Keeping Up with the Kardashians. They called me.
What?
Yeah, that was a
You
real
got to
surprise.
tell us that story.
Yeah, I was absolutely surprised. They made me sign an NDA to not reveal it until the show aired, and they were really interested in the CSETI, or methods to do CE5 work, because as it turns out, they live in the Malibu area where there is an enormous amount of activity. This is right off the coast of Southern California, which the Santa Catalina Channel is filled with UFOs and USOs. And so I basically did an interview with them and told them that, yeah, it's absolutely possible. What you do is basically meditate, telepathically reach out. If you want, you can use a nice, powerful flashlight that can help you to communicate, perhaps, with ETs show up, and you can blink your lights at them and they'll blink back at you. And so it was a Zoom interview. But what's really funny to me is I told them, be prepared because something could show up. And if you believe what they put on their episode, and I think it's legit, an orb of some kind did show up. And it fits the sort of description we hear from people in that area. And it quite frightened Khloe Kardashian and her boyfriend, who had stayed up real late and quickly, as soon as this thing appeared, they rushed inside and said, "Don't abduct me. Take Preston. You can have him, not us." So yeah, I mean, it was fun. They were very nice people, I will say, and it was an interesting experience for me.
So, as far as your new book that's out, why should people get it? What's the most important thing in it that you think people should get from reading it?
Yeah, I think this book is actually really an important piece of research, not to toot my own horn, but I think it reveals some really interesting aspects to the UFO phenomena, some patterns that are well known, perhaps, like generational contact. There's one case which outlines 4 generations of people who are having contact, but it also shows the huge variety of ETs people see. I just think it's darn interesting because these are cases which are across the United States, Canada. There was a case in Peru, one in Argentina, England, France, Australia, China. So I think you get a nice broad spectrum of the UFO phenomena, and it shows how truly strange it is. It's not all about people being pulled on board and examined by grays. It's far, far more than that. And I think it really illustrates how the paranormal is inextricably connected to a lot of these cases. So we do see people seeing Bigfoot and having uh, angelic sightings or demonic encounters or all kinds of paranormal phenomena such as precognition and past life recall and mediumship and shadow people and psychic phenomena of all kinds, levitation. So I think it really does show how truly complex and highly strange the UFO phenomena can be. I'm pretty excited about it, actually.
Now, I know this could be a long answer, but if you could just say it shortly. I mean, you mentioned the Greys seem to be one of the more common to abduct, and they might be artificial intelligence. What would be like the intentions of some of the various civilizations? Because of course they may not all have the same intention. So you mentioned earlier about 5 different possible civilizations you're aware of. From what your understanding is, do they all have the same intention, or what's the difference?
Well, I would say generalizing, yes. I don't care what type of ETs a person has been in contact with, the message is largely the same. I think we've got a pretty good handle on what the ET agenda is. One, it's definitely to publicize their presence, to let people know we are not alone. We can see that with all the many UFO displays. So I think that is one of the reasons they're here. Another is to warn us against nuclear proliferation and the use of nuclear material in any capacity. Because if you're talking to a gray or praying mantis or a little blue being or a light being or a tall white, that is the message they're giving people. There is definitely a medical theme that runs through onboard encounters. When people are taken on board and physically examined, this is the most common experience. And I think that speaks to the healing and the collection of genetic material. They are collecting plants of all kinds, soil samples, animals of all kinds. Uh, so I believe that they're very much concerned about that we might be facing an existential crisis and want to prevent all the life on this planet from going extinct and are taking steps in that regard. So that's definitely an agenda. The hybrid baby program, if you want to call it that, is one of the agendas, certainly of the Greys. I think one major thing that they're really trying hard to do is to elevate people's psychic awareness, because this is a very, very prominent pattern. People who have contact experience what you would call a psychic awakening and come away from their experiences with abilities that we call supernatural or paranormal. They're not really, they're natural, but levitation, mediumship, healing, these are the main ones, but telepathy and precognition, right down the line. That is absolutely something that they're trying to do. And they've said this in very clear words that this is our gift to you for working with us. I've heard that over and over again. They really want us to know that we are them, they are us, we are one, that we all share a common heritage. That's another message a lot of people get. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, warnings about pollution, our warlike ways, greed and corruption, destruction of the environment, the chopping down of forests. This comes up all the time. So that's clearly another agenda. They're trying to raise our awareness of how we're treating each other and our planet. So yeah, I think we've got a pretty good handle on why they're here, but there are multiple agendas for sure.
Yeah, I always, for pollution, always find fireworks aren't mentioned enough because that seems like terrible pollution and it's fairly useless.
Yeah, I actually did a study of the 4th of July and found out that UFOs show up in large numbers on that day. And I always kind of dismiss reports on the 4th of July because they're fireworks. This is what I'm thinking. But if you look at the files of MUFON, Mutual UFO Network, in Newfork, sightings spike on that day. And it's not just Chinese lanterns, party lanterns, or sky lanterns. And, fireworks. These are structured craft with portholes and little beings looking out. It's a good day to see UFOs, ironically. So there's a weird connection there. But they're absolutely attracted to military bases of any kind, prisons, hydroelectric stations, dams, airports, anything technological, rocket launches. In fact, I studied all the rocket launch cases, and I found 3 cases, Hannibal, where UFOs showed up during 4 cases now, toy rocket launches. So that's how closely they're observing our technology. They're very much watching over us in everything we do.
Very interesting. Someone wants to know if they have an encounter. Can they just send it to you on your website or can they Facebook you or something?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I have a YouTube channel, a website, which you're listing there, where you can get my email, which is very easy to remember. It's prestonufo@gmail.com. I always love hearing from people, whether they've got a question, need some answers because they're having contact, have a story to share, or a comment. This is an important subject. What you're doing with this podcast is making a difference because we're now seeing an absolute new era for ufology and really all humanity. I think we're now at the point where we have to stop calling UFOs a mystery. We know what they are. We know we are being visited by extraterrestrials. The evidence is there. It's time for a whole new approach to stop trying to prove this or debunk it and instead try to figure out how we can interact in a more open way.
Interesting. And just before we go, if you've seen me fidgeting, my dog's been trying to get me to pet her the whole interview because I think she was jealous your dog appeared and she didn't yet. So Piper says hello, and I'll let you close this off with whatever you want to plug. Thanks a lot for appearing. Very interesting.
Hey, I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, I have my new book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. I'm super excited about it. I've got, now that's 31 books, so symmetry is another favorite. And I think I would just leave people with one thing. Don't look to our governments for answers on UFOs. They've never told the truth, and they're not telling the truth now. Almost everything we know about the UFO phenomenon comes from one source. It's not our governments. It's not the scientists and the pundits and commentators on TV who have never had an encounter and haven't even studied the subject and are just voicing opinions. It's the contactees. That's where we should look to for answers. And basically, you can have your own encounters. Ultimately, true knowledge comes only from personal experience. So we just need to leave fear behind and start doing real critical thinking and look at what's true and what's not, what's disinformation, what's misinformation. Don't buy into the fear. Don't buy into the ET threat narrative. It's not true. We have friends out there. We have for millennia. They've always been here. They're still here. So that would be my message.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews,